This morning as we look at Epaphroditus, I just want to make two comments and see what we can learn about his life. But the first comment I want to make is, who was he? Who was Epaphroditus? You know, when we look at Epaphroditus, we don't know a lot about his background. The name Epaphroditus is a very interesting name. It was a Greek name. It means belonging to or favoured by Aphrodite. And it was the Greek goddess of love. It was a very common name at the time. I don't think there's many people today that we would call Epaphroditus. Maybe if you live in Greece or somewhere, today it would be. We should look at the disciples, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, very common names. And Epaphroditus wasn't a common name. It was a common name, but it's not used today. A bit like Judas. We don't call many people Judas today, do we? But from what we can gather, Epaphroditus was of Greek origin. He had been educated in the Greek culture. He would have been a protege of Timothy. In the Bible, if you look at the New Testament, Epaphroditus was shortened to the name of Epaphras. And if you go to Paul's writings in Colossians chapter 1, verse 7 and 4:12, Paul says this. He says, as you learn from Epaphras, our dear fellow servant, who is a faithful minister of Christ on your behalf. And in chapter 4:12, Paul speaks about Epaphras. Epaphras, who is you, who is one of your bondservants in Christ, greets you always, labouring fervently for you in your prayers, that you may stand perfect and in complete will of God. So we look at the Epaphras that is spoken about in Colossians and the one that is spoken about in the Philippians. They're two different people. If you look at a map, you'd see that Colossae and Philippi were quite some distance from each other. If you go back to Acts chapter 16, verse 4, we read that Paul went to Philippi, which is a city in northern Greece, and he planted a church. You know, as I've said before, you read the book of Philippians, it's a book that you want to put very close to your heart. It's a very warm, very loving letter, a church that he was very, very close to. And in this church there would have been a man called Epaphroditus, and we're not too sure if he was converted under the preaching of Paul, or if he came along the scene some later on. But when we read our Bibles, we read that Paul sometime later was in Rome and in jail. And the church at Philippi had heard about this situation. And they had a great love, and they had a great concern and a great passion for Paul and his welfare, so they had a collection for Paul and they raised some money. And obviously with Epaphroditus, they would have had a very high regard for this man. The fact that he was willing to go says a lot about who he was. He had a servant's heart, he was a loyal worker, and the church must have thought very, very highly of whom he was. They wouldn't have just sent anybody, they wouldn't have said, look, does anybody want to go to Rome and take some money to Paul? If half a dozen hands had gone up, they would have selected the right person. So they selected Epaphroditus because there was something about this man that they knew that they could trust, and a man who had a servant's heart. And even Paul acknowledged this in chapter 4:18 of Philippians. He said this. He said, I have all and abound. I am full, having received from Epaphroditus the thing sent from you, a sweet smelling aroma, an acceptable sacrifice, well pleasing to God. So Paul acknowledges Epaphroditus in a very positive way. But it's also interesting to note, I may mention of this before, that in Bible days, if you're going to take some money to somebody for some distance, you wouldn't take a bag full of cash. You get robbed. You get stolen. You might lose it. So probably the church at Philippi went and they would have exchanged the money and they would have bought some pearls and they would have sewn it into the garment of Epaphroditus, and off he would have gone. He would have had a little bit of money, which would have got him through for a while. And scholars say that the distance from Philippi to Rome was just over 1,000 kilometres. It would have taken about 2 months to get there. And it probably would have been, if you took Sunday off, it was about 20 kilometres a day. Now, if you walk 20 kilometres a day for 6 days a week, I think you'd be tired. You'd probably enjoy a day off. Maybe he was able to hitch a ride on a horse, or maybe took a few boats to get across. But it would have been a tough journey to get to Poland. To go 1,000 kilometres in those days, it was certainly a long thing to do. Then Epaphroditus would have arrived in Rome. He would have sought out Paul, and that would have been an interesting experience. because nobody really knew whereabouts in Rome Paul was, and he was a prisoner. And also, if Caesar wanted Paul out of the way, anybody else who was associated with Paul would have got executed as well. So any acquaintance with Paul, it was basically prepared to put your life at stake, because you could lose your head by being associated there with Paul. And if we go on, we know that Paul was executed about 66 AD. And so for Epaphroditus to go, there was a lot at stake. His life was at stake, literally. There was a sacrifice of time, sacrifice of income. And we don't know if he was a married man or a single man, probably a single man. He would have had to say goodbye to his mum and dad and siblings and to the church at Philippi. He said, look, I'm going, but I don't know when I'm coming back, if I come back. But Epaphroditus had a simple job, and that was to serve Paul in jail. He would have been helping out with the menial tasks, like buying food, buying his parchments, washing his clothes. It wasn't the most glamorous of things to do. But his job was quite simply to serve Paul in whatever capacity that Paul wanted. So if Paul wanted something from the market, Epaphroditus would go. And that was his job. A very humble man. So here we read about Epaphroditus. He's prepared to go to Philippi, to Rome, a long journey. He would find Paul, and he was there to serve him in whatever way that he could. And that says a lot about the character of this man. But then we look at the second observation, is the commendations of Epaphroditus. Look at verse 25. It's interesting what Paul says. He says, yet I consider it necessary to send to you Epaphroditus, my brother, fellow worker, fellow soldier, but your messenger, and the one who ministered to my need. And so rather than Paul saying about how wonderful he was, what does Paul do? He says, I'm going to send him back. It wasn't a disciplinary or something, or no Epaphroditus had done something wrong, but as we're going to find out, he was sick. But Paul makes 4 observations about this man. 4 wonderful observations. The first thing is he calls him a brother. Now, if you have a physical family, which we all do, and you've got siblings, you all know that quite often that the siblings will stick up for each other. If one gets bad words or attacked, the other siblings will stick up and they'll say, I'm going to defend my brother or my sister. One thing I found out about the Christian church is those bonds are much stronger. You know, there's a spiritual bond where Christ is at the centre of those relationships. And maybe you've had that experience where you go to a church as a visitor, you're there once or twice, or you meet a Christian brother, and you just start talking straight away. There's this bond. That's the beauty about being a Christian, is there's a bond straight away. You may only feel like you've known them 5 minutes, but you feel like you've known them your whole life. You can sit down there and you can talk with them, you can share with them about Christ, because there's that brother, there's that sister in Christ. And so for Paul, there was this bond with Epaphroditus. You know, he was probably on that same spiritual level. They would have been able to be together, they would have been able to encourage each other in the Christian faith. There was a very deep spiritual connection as a Christian brother. But he also calls him a fellow worker. You know, Epaphroditus was serving Paul. He was on the same team. And Paul's job was different to Epaphroditus. He's needed to be in the background. You know, when we think about it, we're all fellow workers, aren't we, within the church? Now, as a church, we support missionaries overseas. Now, when you think about a missionary or somebody who's in full-time Christian service, you may feel as though you're a bit behind the scenes. You're very insignificant. And for Paul, he would have been preaching the gospel, planting churches, discipling new believers. But here's the bottom thing, the bottom line. Behind every Christian worker, there are people who will support them. People who will give to them financially. People who will pray for them. People who, if they say, look, I need some new clothes, and my clothes are running out. You know, can you send me some clothes? Or your shoes are a bit bigger than the local shoes that you get into a country, they'll send up some new shoes or something. We need those people. Here's the truth. Each one of us is on the same team. Each one of us is serving the God, but in slightly different capacities. We're all fellow workers in this church. I may be the pastor. That doesn't mean to say I'm the most important person in the church. No. Everybody does their job. I mean, if we didn't have a secretary or a treasurer, the church would be in a bit of a mess. We didn't have elders Or people that will back in the church on a Sunday. The church would look nice. Those who put the maintenance into the church and a variety of other jobs. People who do the communion and do Sunday school every week. We are all fellow workers. And so here Paul was saying to Epaphroditus, he said he is a fellow worker, a great one. Then he uses a fellow soldier. It's a military term. Epaphroditus was a man who could be relied upon in the heat of a battle. He was not a man who would flee when the heat got up. It's interesting that one of the analogies that the Bible compares the Christian walk as is what is a soldier. Each one of us today is a soldier in God's army. We're all on the front line. We all need to stick together. We can't depart. We can't run away when the heat gets on. We need to rely upon each other. And just maybe Paul was thinking of another young man who departed. If you go into Acts chapter 13 and 14, we read about a man called John Mark. He went on a mission trip with Paul and Barnabas. The Bible says that he departed. And then when Paul came back, he wanted to go back on the mission trip. It says they had a sharp contention. And Paul said, I'm not taking John Mark back. And that was a hard decision to make, because you remember when Paul became a Christian, who was one of the first people that met Paul? Barnabas. It was a strong bond, so both men went their own ways and they got some different people on board. But the interesting thing about Mark was that later on, he became useful. The gospel of a second chance. And when Paul was in jail in 2 Timothy 4:11, who does he ask for? He says, bring who? John Mark. He is useful. The one who was once useless is useful. We say the God of grace, the God of a second chance. And you know what we read about John Mark? He wrote the second book of the New Testament. What? Matthew what? Mark. So that's an interesting footnote there. But maybe Paul had this in mind, and he was comparing the two. He said he was a man that could be relied upon in the heat of the battle. As I said, we, as a church, we're in a spiritual battle. We're all on the front lines, whether we know it or not. And the last thing that we can do is turn away, is fall out. God needs us. We're all part of serving in the spiritual battle on that front line. The fourth thing he says he ministered to my need. The word minister is an interesting word. It was used of a government official who passionately was dedicated to his duties that he discharged at his own expense. This government official knew that he was doing a service of special importance. And Paul says this about Epaphroditus. For Epaphroditus, it wasn't just a job. He did it passionately, out of his own expense. It would have cost him his time, loss of income, loss of seeing family and friends. But he went there, he's passionate about it. When we serve the Lord what? Out of love, don't we? Out of passion. Not out of duty or obligation, because we feel we have to. No. We serve the Lord because what we love Him. We see what He's done at the cross for us, and anything He asks us to do it's not a duty, but it's a joy, because of our love for Him. And I could just imagine that here was Epaphroditus. He didn't consider, I've got to do it to keep Paul happy. No, he did it because he loved the Lord. There was that love, there was that passion, and we need people like that in the church today. That when they serve the Lord, it's not out of obligation, but because of passion, because they love the Lord. And this is the type of man that Epaphroditus would have been. As I said earlier, we don't know a lot about the background about Epaphroditus, but we see a lot about his character. As people say, character counts. And we need people like this in the church today. A fellow worker, a fellow soldier, somebody who ministers to their need. A brother in Christ. And boy, oh boy, the church needs people like this today. He would have been a wonderful person to have been around. Someone who worked quietly, somebody who was diligently behind the scenes, someone who was loving and passionate, and he worked hard. And so Paul makes this very powerful commendation about Epaphroditus was. And it would have been hard to have sent Epaphroditus back. He said, I've got the perfect person. Now I've got to send him back. And it must have broken the heart of Paul today. I said just a moment ago, we need people in the church like that who will labour without recognition, who will serve without accolades, who will work behind the scenes. These are the people that God calls great in the church today. What happened to Epaphroditus? Well, verse 27, we get a hint. For he was indeed sick, almost to the point of death. But God had mercy on him. Not only on him, but also on me, lest I should have sorrow upon sorrow. The question is how did he get sick? This is a question that scholars have been debating for the last 2,000 years. What caused Epaphroditus to get sick? Well, we don't really know. That's the bottom line. Some scholars have said that he could have been attacked on the way. Others have said he got pneumonia. The general view is he caught Roman fever, which is very common, and people died. But we don't know. It's a bit like asking the question, what was Paul's thorn in the flesh? We really don't know. One day we'll find out. But we do know that he got very sick. And as he said, he almost got sick to the point of death. And despite his sickness, what was Epaphroditus? He was more concerned about the church at Philippi, because obviously the word had got back. He was more concerned about their feelings than his own. And now that's just a characteristic of a wonderful servant. Somebody thinks more of others than that of his own. And it said he was sick to the point of death. Now you think that through. Have you ever been sick to the point of death? I haven't. But he must have hit rock bottom with his health. He must have got very, very sick. Almost to the point of death. But God in his graciousness spared him from death. And as I look at Epaphroditus, it was a job he was prepared to do. He was prepared to serve Paul. He wasn't concerned about his own life. He was more concerned about the church at Philippi. He's probably thinking, what are they going to think about me when I go back? Would they deem me as a failure? And so as Paul's writing this, he's saying to the church, this guy's not a failure. When you think about it, over the years, history tells us that thousands and thousands and thousands of men and women have given their lives to serve Christ. Now some of them may have lasted a week or two. They've gone to a new country, and there's been a fever that's come through. Or maybe there was an outbreak. People didn't like the Christians. Look at the Boxer Rebellion that happened in China. Thousands of missionaries were killed. Some missionaries didn't even get off the boat because they died on the way because of the conditions. And you may say it was a waste, but no, it wasn't. They were obedient. And when we serve God, that's what God calls us to be. It's not to be successful. He calls us to be what? Obedient. You think about the life of Jeremiah. He preached for 40 years and he saw no fruit, but he was obedient. Noah was 120 years, and how many converts did he get onto the ark? Zilch. Just his family, but he was obedient. Epaphroditus was obedient. And this is what a servant is about. He's obedient to the call that's put upon his life. I came across a few quotes about what a servant is, and I'll just read them to you. Someone said this, the concept of servanthood is a recurring theme throughout the Bible. It's a call to humility, to obedience, to sacrifice, to love, and to faithfulness. Servanthood is the act of serving others with humility and love. It is a selfless act that puts the needs of others before our own. In the Bible, servanthood is not just a suggestion, but a commandment. Mark 10:45 we read, "For the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." The importance of servanthood in the Bible cannot be overstated. It is a fundamental aspect of our relationship with God and with others. As we serve others, we reflect the love of Christ and fulfill our purpose as his followers. Somebody else said this, servanthood is the state, the condition, and the quality of somebody who lives as a servant. A servant is first of all one who is under submission to one another. For Christians, that means submission to God and then submission to one another, then one in submission as a servant. A servant is one who seeks to meet the real needs of others whom he is serving. To put it another way, servanthood is the condition of being a servant to others, of ministry to others, rather than being a servant of self. It means willingly going out to minister to others and to do whatever it takes to accomplish for what is best for one another. And I thought that is so true. We are called to be servants. It's not an option, but it's a command. God has called us to be servants. Let me go into verse 28, and I'll read verse 28 to 30, and Paul said this. He said, "Therefore I sent him all the more eagerly, that when you see him you may rejoice, and I may be less sorrowful. Receive him therefore in the Lord with all gladness, and hold such men in esteem. Because of the work of Christ he came close to death, not regarding his life to supply what is lacking in your service to me. Notice what he says. He says, this guy's a treasure. I'm sending him back. Now, what a wonderful man to have had. He's sending him back. He said, look, I'm sending him back to you. Use him. He's a wonderful person to have had around. But it's also interesting as you look at verse 30. If you look at it's a very interesting verse. It's a verse that we can skip over, but there's a few wonderful words in there which has got some wonderful truths. One version will say he risked his life. I've got New King James that says not regarding his life. Now we can skip over that. We think, okay, we'll just go on. But there's a very, very powerful message. And the audience would have got it straight away. Now, I'm not one to give a Greek lesson, but I'm going to give it to you this morning, right? So I don't expect, I'm not going to ask you next week what was the Greek word I shared with you today, but it's an interesting one. It's called, and I'm going to say it, I've tried, it's called parabolumi. It may not mean a lot to you right now, but it will in a minute. Now, I started off by saying that Epaphroditus means favoured by Aphrodite. Now, Paul is playing upon the name, because she was also the goddess of gambling as well. And it was common for men at the gambling table when they threw the dice, I would shout out, Epaphroditus! Can you imagine going to, I know you wouldn't, but someone goes to a casino today and say Epaphroditus, they'll probably look at it and say they're a bit weird. But that was a common phrase. And Paul's audience would have known exactly what he was saying now. Paul plays on the words. He says this. He says Epaphroditus risked something more valuable, and that was his life for the gospel. And they would have picked it up. You know, what more valuable can you risk your life for? You know, he was prepared to give his life for the gospel. People would go out there and gamble some coins to try and make some more money. But for Epaphroditus, he was prepared to risk his life for the gospel. And that's service, isn't it? A Christian who is prepared to put it all on the line for Christ. Now maybe today we'd say in our language he was a kamikaze Christian. Is that vernacular? He had a single focus. A man who's prepared to die for his cause. Now, it's through Epaphroditus, something else happened which we are blessed. Paul wrote a letter to the church at Philippi. He took the letter back. He gave it to the church at Philippi. And guess what? You and I can read it today. So something good came out of his sickness. He's been a blessing for Christians over the last 2,000 years. You know, what he did was not a waste. God used him in a mighty way. And as I was thinking about that, I asked the question and I say, now when it comes to serving, even in our church at Werribee, what is it that God is calling you to do? We speak about this whole concept of mission and getting out into the community. What is it that God is calling you to do? What is the sacrifice? And so I've been thinking about doing something that can be effective in our community, but you know there's a bit of sacrifice involved. It's going to cost me some time. It may cost me a bit of money as well, but is it worth it for the gospel? Of course it is. So often churches say, well, it's the pastor's job to do all the evangelism. It doesn't work that way. Each one of us can be involved. And we are called to serve. Just like I've used the illustration about that Sunday school in America, who was serving God in the same church for 71 years as a Sunday school teacher. At the age of 90, they asked when she was going to retire. She says, I'm not planning for it yet. And how are we serving God in this church? How are we using the gifts, the talents, and the abilities that God has given to serve in the community in which we live? And maybe there is going to be sacrifice. Our time, our money. You know, we've got to cut back something so we can serve God. We're in the same situation, aren't we? Are we prepared to serve like that? You know, God takes ordinary people, uses them for His glory. He says, I want you to serve me, and this is how you can serve. You know, I said to you a moment ago about that Greek word, parabolumi. I hope I pronounced it right. Now, in the New Testament, we're told, this is from, we're told in history, that there was a group of Christians who took that name to heart. And they called themselves the Parabolina, which is from that Greek word. And this meant gamblers. And what they would do was they would visit the sick, they would visit those who were in dangerous situations, but nobody would help them. And in the process, they were able to share the gospel. Many of them lost their lives in the process. History tells us that in the year 252 AD, at the city of Carthage, there was a huge plague. And one of the bishops spoke to the Christians, and a lot of the Christians would bring in the dead corpses. They would look after the sick. They had a wonderful testimony. And in the process, people came to know Christ. And they took it from the example of who Epaphroditus was. He had a wonderful legacy. Now we look at the life of Epaphroditus. It wasn't a life wasted. It was a life that touches many people. He had a profound influence upon history. This is what a devoted servant looks like. And I ask each one of us today, as we're here at this church, are we a devoted servant? How are we using our time, our gifts and our talents that God has given to us in this church and also into our community as well? This is where the application comes in. This morning as I close, I just want to say this. We spoke about what a servant is. We spoke about last week, we looked at the life of Christ. And we look at it today with Epaphroditus, somebody that we can relate to. Today in the church, we need men, women, boys and girls who will put everything on the line for Jesus. People who will hold nothing back. We need a church full of people who are balanced in the work, who have a love for others, who have a love for God. You say, Lord, here I am, use my life for the glory of you. God will use your life and my life to touch the world. Epaphroditus was a lovely Christian. He lived up to his name. I think we can be lovely Christians and have that kind of life if we follow his example. Wonderful example of what a servant is. May that be said of us. May we pray. Gracious Father in heaven, we thank you for the life of Epaphroditus. We thank you for a man who's prepared to serve you, in a tough situation with Paul. But we thank you for his example. Thank you for what Paul wrote about his life, and we thank you that we can be inspired by him. And I pray for each one of us here at this church that will have a desire to serve in whatever capacity, with whatever gifts that you have given to us. To serve those within the church, but also to use those gifts to serve the community and using that as a vehicle to be able to